Welcome back to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with my friend and colleague Tim Padgett to talk more about my recent conversation with Ashley Hales on her book, A Spacious Life. Welcome back, Tim.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to this particular conversation. The conference you referred to, was that a Davenant thing that you'd been to at the beginning?
Yeah, that was the Davenant Institute Regional Convivium here in Florida, which I went to only because it was right on the beach, and I got to enjoy a little bit of surf and full moon afterwards, which was nice.
Well, you so rarely get to go to the beach, so.
Yeah, it never happens for me. This conversation was part of a two-part segment that I really wanted to do on Upstream. And the next episode will be coming out with Kelly Kapic, who is my second guest to talk about limits. But I wanted to invite Ashley on for an introduction to the concept because the way that she introduces limits are as a kind of governor on our day-to-day lives that remind us we cannot do everything we want to do. And so her book is obviously written for kind of frazzled, overworked, underslept parents, particularly moms. And that's a bit of a change of pace for Upstream, but I see that firsthand every day with my wife, and I experience that firsthand every day as a parent. And I think that the pressure to overcome limits can be particularly strong in the context where those limits, at least a few of them, come in the form of hungry little mouths who, want to be fed, and hearts that need to be loved, and minds that need to be educated and brought up into maturity. That's a limit that parents face. And I think that beginning in that really down-to-earth way, before we get into the deeper theology, is the right approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of most people throughout time spend their lives doing what we sometimes derisively call the mundane, the ordinary, the common sorts of things. I've often joked with my wife that she gets more sleep, but I get more rest. And that is that very often I'm awake after she's fallen asleep and I'm up before she's up. But I definitely, in my lifestyle, if I want to pause and just chill for a minute, I can do that. Whereas my wife is raising 4 little mini-me's, 4 boys, and she can't do that. And so I think that seeing the importance of getting that rest, being intentional with those limits, and not seeing it as a bad thing, not seeing it as a sinful thing. I remember when I was in grad school at one point, I was completely stressed out about what things were going. And one of my professors, he said, it's like, hey, finiteness is not a sin. And I think it's very hard for us as Americans with our good Protestant work ethic, which is all in all a good thing, and our go, go, go mentality, that we can very easily begin to think that not just be productive is good, but to admit any sort of limitation, any sort of finiteness, and see that as not just weakness, which it may or may not be, but as sin. And I think that the Christian world tends to take any sort of limitation sometimes. Kind of the Americanized Christianity can take any sort of limitation as a sin.
I had a friend who told me when he started seminary, one of his professors announced at the beginning of the semester that if there were men in the class who had wives and children, which there were several, and they ended up with an A at the end of the semester, they probably sinned to make it happen. They probably sinned against their families to make it happen, which is quite a, recognition coming from someone on whom it reflects how their students do. But this professor had a very down-to-earth view of what you can and can't do.
I like that. Actually, I had a similar experience in seminary where one of my professors, a guy named Michael Williams, one of my fellow students asked, well, I'm doing all this work in seminary, but I'm not having time to do ministry things in addition to doing seminary. And he says, no. Your task right now is this. This is where you're supposed to spend your time. He didn't mean by that you need to go work yourself into a delirium in your studies, but he meant you can't do everything. And there is something very encouraging and freeing with recognizing, as you said with that example, that the circumstances of life are going to cause limitations. You're not going to be able to do everything you'd want to do, but also recognize the value in cutting off opportunities. Even good things sometimes need to be cut off for the sake of better things.
So the theology of limits is interesting to me. The fact that human beings are created as finite creatures We are not our creator. There's a creator-creature distinction, and we'll get into that more next week. But the distinction there between a creator who can do everything, be everywhere, know everything, and has inexhaustible power, and creatures who can do none of those things, who have finite supplies of time, power, energy, knowledge, forces us to depend on God. But we, in all sorts of areas of our lives, we try to fight that dependency. We try to pretend that we're infinite creatures and not creatures at all. I guess that's sort of confusing the creator-creature distinction. And Ashley brought this back to the Garden of Eden, to the attempt to be like God. And of course, there are all kinds of interesting ways you can approach the narrative of the primal sin, the first fall of mankind, right? So I remember back when I talked with Matthew Sleeth, he kind of put a suicidal spin on it, where he said that the act of choosing against the source of life, to disobey God and attempt to seize knowledge for ourselves, having been told that we would die, was an act of suicide, an act of self-harm. And there's a dimension of that. I was just thinking about that yesterday on my kind of walk while I listened to the finished episode. But Ashley approaches it from the perspective of an attempt to be infinite, attempt to seize godhood for ourselves. And there is a sense in which the effort to be all-knowing, which is kind of what Adam and Eve were doing, is an ongoing temptation for humankind. And that's another area where we try to transcend our created limits and are at war in that sense with our very nature. So we don't just try to do everything in the modern world, we also try to know everything. And we're very assisted in that illusion by these glowing squares that we keep in our pockets. You know, we talk all about this, and I think I mentioned Sherry Turkle's book in the episode there. But the illusion that being able to Google anything you want and being able to check Twitter and see whatever your feed happens to have coughed up at the moment and get that illusion of omniscience about the world around you really does shape how you think about yourself. And I don't think we're better off for it. That's another area where, especially those of us who sort of watch the news and comment on culture, need to take stock of our lack of omniscience, of our finitude, and be willing to step back from that news cycle.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the background to the rancor and the temper tantrums that so characterize social media conversations has to do with this presumption of omniscience. Well, I think it's two things. It's one, there's a presumption that we can know all things, and there's the terrified realization that we can't know all things. We see like you guys commented in your conversation about, you feel the need to comment on every news story that happens to come up. Well, there's no way you can have an expert knowledge on every single situation that comes up. When we see these stories. What was the actor who did the hoax about a homophobic racist attack in Chicago or whatever it was? And so many people came out so very quickly to claim to have known exactly what had happened. They totally believed everything that had happened. They thought they had all the facts in hand. Then all of a sudden, it came out that we didn't have all the facts in hand. A few details came forward that kind of undercut all that. Now, that's an extreme example, but very often we want this simplistic understanding of the world. We expect that we can, simply by glancing at a few details, we know everything that could have happened. It's a rejection of the complexity of just ordinary life. It's a rejection of our just innate finitude as created beings, to think that with just a few details, I can extrapolate from that everything could have happened, and I can have an all-knowing understanding. And I think also with that comes this expectation of universal expertise. You and I are good at certain things. We're not good at other certain things. And that's good. That's part of who we are. We all recognize the beauty when we see someone who's a master of his craft, someone who's a master musician, someone who's a master writer, someone who's a master engineer, whatever it is, that someone who has developed those skills. And we tend to think that we can all have that knowledge if we just try hard enough. But there's only 24 hours in a day. There's only 7 days a week, and so on. And we must have those times of rest. We can't be experts at all things, yet we somehow think we can be. so I think that like I said, I think that one of the reasons there's so much tension in social media things is, as your guest said, that it gives a sense, the glowing rectangles, as you put it, give us a sense of omniscience and omnipresence, that we can have access to all the information. And we simply can't. It gives us the illusion of it, this disembodied state that we can be kind of floating and be all knowing about all situations, but we simply cannot. But we think we can, and so we're very insecure about that. And so we lash out and we strike and make these overconfident statements that don't have a basis, rather than saying, that sounds like it's really complex and I need more information. We are terrified to say that. We're terrified to admit that we don't know everything, and it will take some time to tease things out.
I wonder how much of our ability to trick ourselves into thinking that we can be omniscient, omnipresent, omnicompetent, and without limits has to do with our divorce from reminders in natural revelation or general revelation of our finitude. So last week, when I kind of stood beside the beach and watched the Atlantic waves come just thundering in, I mean, we went out and kind of swam in it a little bit. They're powerful. We call it the washing machine, and it'll roll you over. It's not like the Gulf. It's not like my side.
I was about to say, this is the Atlantic.
Yes, this is the Atlantic. This is the major leagues. This was, well after dark. So the full moon's out. The stars are kind of blazing on the sides. And it gives you a sense of your own smallness. It gives you a tangible, tactile reminder of just what a puny creature you are in the grand scheme of things. That's just one dimension of the way that the world itself reminds us of our smallness. I think back on Carl Trueman's book and the way he points out that the seasons, the sort of requirements of an agricultural economy, the dependence on the rain and the sun and all of the cycles that you don't control, that are just given to you, was a reminder that reality comes to us in large part and is given. We don't shape it ourselves. So it made a mimetic way of approaching ourselves and our culture very natural. It made sense to us that so much was a given. Well, now we have separated ourselves for the most part for most of us from those cycles. I mean, we can go to the grocery store and buy an apple when apples were never in season before. And you can tell it's not apple season because they usually aren't very good during the off season. But so who knows what kind of hydroponic indoor nonsense they're using to sort of grow those apples, or maybe they're shipping them in from across the world. But the poetic way of seeing ourselves emerges naturally from that lack of contact with things that remind us who we really are, how small we really are. I mean, there was a moment, and I come back to nature again and again because this is just A, my favorite thing, and B, the most sort of tangible illustration of this for me. But one time when I was in Colorado, camping in the Estes Park there, I remember thinking, well, the sun's going down. I want to get a good view up the top of this valley. So I'm just going to climb this little hill of boulders and get to the top and then, look out because it's going to be really cool. Well, me and this other guy climbed it, or thought we had climbed it. At some point, I realized this is not a hill. This is a mountain. More just kept appearing and appearing and appearing. And at some point, he took off and, smoked me because he was a better rock scrambler than I was. And the sun was, it was behind the other mountain. It was almost dark. I could see our campfire way down at the bottom with the other students. And I realized, man, I am way up here. I don't have a flashlight. I'm getting really thirsty and it's going to be very difficult for me to get down here. And it was just I didn't have a doubt that I could eventually make it down, but it was this realization that it's going to be well after dark by the time I get down. And I feel very small, very overpowered by this landscape in a way that I didn't even expect a couple of moments ago. And very few people have that experience anymore of realizing that you're at the mercy of even something as benign as a mountain slope, to say nothing of getting caught in a storm like Martin Luther famously did. And that kind of changed his outlook. But all of these little reminders used to confront people and don't as much in a world where we control everything or think we control everything. And I'm fascinated by the way that shapes our deep psychology, by the way that allows us to live in the midst of an illusion. And I wonder if it might be good for a lot of us to feel the power of waves, to feel the peril of getting stuck on a mountain slope and, with the setting sun, just to remind us who we really are.
Yeah. Former pastor of mine, again, Jason Tippett, looks like a mountain man. He's got a beard, this massive, like Civil War era beard thing. He loves going out into nature because he realizes that nature does not need him. And I always liked how he put that, because you go into the mountainside and you can see that mountain has been there, at least for thousands and thousands of years, depending on your age of creation view there. You can go and you can see the power that these things will be continuing whether you are there or not. That it does not care. And there's something awe-inspiring about that, literally awe-inspiring about it. And as you were talking there, it reminded me of the conversation last week with Herman about art and beauty and the way that, what makes looking at the stars across the sky, it's not merely, oh, that's pretty shining lights in the darkness. It's you see your smallness. You see your limitations. You cannot compete with that. You see a great storm, or as you were talking about, a great wave, and you know that could squash you in a moment. And so there's a strange pleasure, I think, that we get from recognizing that. And there's, to use the word from last week, resonance. There's a resonance that happens when you see something, a huge mountain, a huge storm, a huge whatever, then you realize your smallness. I remember several years ago, my sister's husband, he was a pastor in Norfolk, Virginia, and we took a tour of the Navy base, the largest Navy base in the world. And at one point, we passed by, I think it was 5 aircraft carriers. Mind you, that's more aircraft carriers than any other country in the world has. It's a huge, powerful fleet. And all my American pride began to rise, like, haha, look at us, look at us. But as you know, I love military history, and I know that you take that fleet out to sea, and a storm, it's less likely to happen now because we got satellites and whatnot. But in World War II, there was this instance where a typhoon near the Philippines came and wrecked an American fleet. And you think of the Spanish Armada, which my British ancestors will proudly say that they defeated the Spanish Armada, but they had a little help from God in the form of a hurricane. And you see the smashing power of that. It's humbling, but it's this strange kind of beautiful humbling. Or again, here in Colorado, moving here, you go for a hike in the mountains and you realize you're not the top of the food chain. There are things here that can and will eat you. And that's terrifying, but it's also kind of fascinating at the same time too.
Yeah, there's some theology going on there, and it's very biblical as well. The whole book of Job, or at least the parts where God enters the conversation toward the end and begins to set Job in his place, are a testimony to the fact that creation itself can tell us much about ourselves and much about our own smallness and limitation. What does God do? He produces example after example from creation and says, do you know where the snow is before it falls? Do you know who keeps the storehouses? Do you know who feeds the baby lions? Do you know who hears the raven, the raven chicks when they call for food? Do you know who has power over, Behemoth and Leviathan? These are these creatures of mythical proportions that terrify you and that you could never possibly tame or touch, and yet they're pets for me. Do you know anything about the stars? Were you there when I laid all this out and created the things that, Job, you can't even see yet, and your descendants will see through the Webb and Hubble space telescopes? Did you do any of that? Okay, well, if you did that, then go ahead and tell me how to run the universe. But since you did not, maybe you ought to be quiet, because, as well, I can't say the interpretation that former colleague of ours, Roberto, gave on Job, but it was in essence, you are a very insignificant little creature, and I am God, and you should probably put your hand over your mouth and repent in sackcloth and ashes, which is exactly what Job does. But it was a reminder of his own limitations. But notice, God does not bring those examples to bear on Job in order to sort of grind him into the dust and smash him and say, what a worthless little creature you are. In the end, he does it to remind Job that he is a limited creature who is designed to depend upon God and to trust God's wisdom, even when he doesn't see all the reasons, because he doesn't know all the reasons. And Job, in the end, rests in that and receives back everything and is richly blessed by God. And that is a picture of what happens again and again in Scripture when God's people live within their limits and depend upon Him, ultimately climaxing with Christ Himself, who in this marvelous paradox that we talked about in the conversation was God and yet at the same time a limited creature. He truly did become one of us. He truly did take on all the limits that circumscribe our lives. And He did this not just in order to save us, but in order to show and reaffirm the goodness of created human life. He actually thinks this is a very good thing to be limited, to be human, to be dependent, to be part of a story that you didn't start and you won't finish, right? I don't want to give away too much, but in my conversation with Kelly Kapic, which listeners will hear next week, he draws on the illustration of the belly button. And I love this because he says that if you look at your belly button, you are looking at a testimony, a profound testimony of your own dependence and limitation, and the fact that you were brought into existence by someone else. You did not bring yourself into existence. You have a known beginning point, and you will have an expiration date. You are not a self-made, autonomous deity, and you don't have the properties of one. You should live as such instead of trying to be something that you're not. Because A, it's diluted to try to act that way. But B, you'll be a lot happier when you actually live as what you are.
Yeah, I think that the example about the finite elements in the life of Christ, that's always hard, a dicey theological proposition to get into there. We see this in the Bible. We see Jesus gets tired and He is weary and He almost gets to the point of sounding frustrated with people, but he's got these limitations, but He's never sinful. In the TV series The Chosen, I don't know if it's The Chosen or just Chosen, there's two moments I remember where they do a really good job of highlighting this. There's one which is a completely fictionalized account where he's having conversations with these young children. It's the first season. And he's tired. He gets done at I actually wrote a column on it called The God Who Sweats. It's talking about the incarnation and that he's working on these things and he's sweating because he's in the Middle East and it's hot there and he sweats. And he cuts his fingers and he has to bandage it up. And then the children, he lies down wearily at the end of the day. And the children wake him up in the morning and he says, couldn't you have waited another half hour or something? I forgot exactly how he says that. And it's just a delightfully human moment of God. It's actually a fictionalized portrayal there. And there was another one, I think it was the first or second episode of the second season, where the character of Jesus, I'll say, he's been off teaching and healing and whatnot, and he comes back and he's exhausted, so much so that his mother has to help him take his shoes off because he's like blistered and stuff. And that, I think that what is helpful about that artistic portrayal, and then because it resonates with what we actually see in the Gospels, is that this is Jesus being limited, Jesus having finite boundaries to what He is able to do as a human being, and yet as Jesus, He's sinless. And I think it should be a great encouragement to us because we get tired, we get limited, we are limited. And I think that all the weary times, and we talked earlier about the weariness of mothers particularly who do so much work and so much unpraised work, that they don't get that societal affirmation that many other roles in life do. And they're exhausted. And then every other person's work, it's okay at the end of the day to be tired. I used to not judge my salvation exactly, but judge whether or not I was doing a good job in life, almost whether or not I had dark circles under my eyes, had I worked myself to exhaustion. And there is a great value in working yourself to weariness, to tiredness. You guys talked about the example of being on the boat. And yes, actually, after you mentioned it, I've seen enough of the show about the crab fishermen up in the Bering Sea.
Deadliest Catch or something.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I've seen enough of that to see the storm-tossed waves. That's really impressive. Anyone could sleep in that. But I wonder, a part of it might be what you guys were kind of hinting at, that he was able to relax where he was. But part of it, I wonder, he was exhausted. He was tired. There is a place to working yourself to being tired, but also to recognize that you can't work yourself to the bone indefinitely. You will stop. Some of the notes that I sent you earlier, I noted that kind of the big turnaround in my life came in my 20s. I was a typical Gen X slacker. I mean, I was not exactly the most accomplished person in the world. I realized the turnaround was when I realized I got more done. I felt more refreshed for the day if I got up earlier than if I got up later. And I think it's because part of it's simply I no longer have the stress of, am I going to make it to work on time? If I get up early and I read a book or do something like that, I am much more productive than if I slept in and waited to the last minute. And that was, one, a recognition of my limitations, that I can't just keep going and going and going. On the other hand, it was imposing limitations on me. So when we talk about the how nature overawes us, and as you pointed out, God's not talking to Job that way in order to squash him. He's trying to remind him, one, that we all are limited by finitenesses of our bodies and things like that. And that's good. We're supposed to recognize that. But I think also we recognize our limitations, something that our culture very often forgets, is that we can't be whatever we want. I cannot be a great singer. I cannot be a great dancer. I cannot be all sorts of things. I might be good at XYZ, but that doesn't mean I can be good at everything. And I think that our culture has taken this to an extreme. The prosperity that we've had in the last couple of centuries has encouraged us to see life as limitless. I can do whatever I want to do. Well, no, you can't. And we see this in vocational questions. People want to be able to have the job. They want to be able to take the classes they want to take. They want to be able to have the job they want to take and live the lifestyle they want to live. They want to have the bodies, whether like the ordinary sense of being an athlete when you can't be, or the more extreme examples when you see the transgender movement. It is this expectation that I can be whatever I want to be. And the only limitation that should come on my life is my own desires. And I think we see that in our society, it's hopeless. And you and I think we've read enough stories of like detransitioners from the transgender movement to see that it's this perpetual race to try and catch up to the saying, to mutilate one's body. And you see it at extreme levels like that, but I think we see it at more ordinary levels. People who think that they can create the sort of life that they want to live, and they just can't. There is a great joy in finding your place in this world, to borrow from Michael W. Smith from about 1990.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the song I was thinking of too. Wow, that's a memory trip. You've hit on exactly why I wanted to have this pair of conversations about limits on Upstream. This ties back into the series of conversations I had about finding God's nature in his world and in paying attention again to creation as something that's good. That's something that actually reveals God to us and reveals our place within God's design. And so we went through all kinds of aspects of that because I wanted to get a full picture of this broad category we call general revelation in theological terms. And then I wanted to zoom in on this issue of limits because I think, as you said, Tim, our culture right now is in an all-out war on limits, not just in the ways that we think about, in terms of trying to be everywhere and do everything and achieve all your goals and enjoy a kind of omniscience through the internet, but also transgressing natural boundaries that have been set up since the beginning of mankind, the marriage covenant, the difference between male and female, the distinctions and relationships and givenness that actually make us who we are, give us our identities, and give shape to our lives. We are in a kind of war against all of those limitations because we see them as bad, because we see them as keeping us from self-actualizing or from self-expressing our individualism in the way that we want to. We have equated, as Carl Trueman says, the expression of your individuality, what you find internally, with the good life. That is just the purpose and meaning of life, is to externalize that inward sentiment of who you are and then conform the world to it. But nobody before very recently thought this way. We are very odd in this way. Most people throughout most of history have recognized in some form a givenness to their lives. And we find again and again that givenness actually makes people much happier. When you recognize that you are a particular person, a son or daughter of particular parents who live in a particular community within a particular nation at a particular time. All of these things are the limitations and givennesses, if I can say that God himself took on in becoming a Jewish boy from the shores of the Sea of Galilee in the first century. And we don't like that. We want to transcend that in all kinds of ways. But that givenness is really important. It actually results in greater happiness. And this is what we got to. I think Ashley and I both mentioned the blank space problem, or the problem of infinite choice. And Maria Baer, our colleague, has written on this for Breakpoint, and then she has referred to it a few other times. There have been experiments done with not mayonnaise, like Ashley Hale's example, but I think it was breakfast cereals was one experiment. She also mentions Second Life and programs like that sort of simulate an alternative life online. And this goes back years. And people would quit these programs or walk out of the cereal aisle when there were too many choices, when nothing was given, because we're creatures that are intended to actually have some givens, to have some default settings that we didn't choose. And when we are presented with ultimate freedom, or our conception of ultimate freedom, which is total choice, we blank. We don't know what to do. We're paralyzed, and we're actually unhappy because of that. Being given things, constraints, a story, a context, a community, it's actually a crucial part of what makes us happy. And when we forget that, we're fighting against our very natures. I mean, I'm going on and on about this, but I think this is a realization that cashes out in so many different ways. And once you finally see it, as you know, whether it's reading Truman's book or reading one of these books, once you finally see that reversal from the mimetic to the poetic way of doing philosophy, doing selfhood, when you realize the switch that's taken place, where instead of allowing reality to conform us to itself, and supremely God himself to conform us, we're trying to conform reality to ourselves, and even God to our image. And it makes us deeply miserable.
Yeah, I think that the conform God to our image thing, it points out that the more things change, the more things stay the same. We talked recently about the golden calves. I forgot the context of that. But the golden calves in ancient Israel, they were literally creating God in their own image. They were taking their ideas of what God should be and making him into that image. We do the same thing today. We're less likely to have a golden calf idol at our churches or temples or what have you, but we will create ourselves in that image. And I think that the lie of our culture is revealed in the language that we use in the more extreme examples. What is it people say? I need to find myself. I need to be myself. That assumes there is a nature that exists that is bigger than my circumstance, that bigger than my immediate circumstances. It assumes there is a true me, a real me that isn't quite fitting in. If you think of this from, the college student who wants to take a year off to go backpacking to go find herself in the, by going across Europe, and it goes to the transgender situation where someone must find their true gender. Well, that's assuming that there is a reality that is bigger than you. There's a reality that is greater, that you won't find peace until you are conformed to it. Now, we do that in all sorts of unhealthy ways in our culture because of our technological advancement and our silliness about things. We continue to seek for this true self, but we reject anything beyond desires, beyond passions. We've rooted the only way to know your true self is my feelings. And I think that's very telling because we've rejected the ancient world's reception of truth and the modernist world of discovery of truth, and we've substituted with the postmodern world's creation of truth. But it's not making us any happier. We need to find that resonance. We need to find that as human beings, we do need to find our true selves, but we're looking in the wrong places.
Yes. Moving forward, I want to keep in mind with the coming episodes that it is a good thing to be human. As Aslan says, you are a descendant of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve. That is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the head of the richest king. Be content. And I think he's speaking that about both our sinfulness and our limits. And our limits are good. We are marvelous creatures, not despite our limits, but because of our limits and dependency on God. There's a marvelous paradox at the heart of being human. And it's very easy for us to forget how marvelous and beautiful it is to be created in the image of God and to be a creature of God, able to know him, to love him, and to be loved by him and in relationship with one another. And this is the heart of general revelation. This is the heart of what we're supposed to realize as we build this relationship with our Creator and with one another. And I think just spending some time focusing in on it, trying to understand the different aspects of the goodness of our creation can help illuminate why so much of the modern worldview, if we can speak in those terms, is harmful and not just immoral or anti-biblical, but actually anti-human. That's what we're trying to do here. That's what I'm kind of trying to do with these episodes, to get us to a point where we realize and are deeply persuaded that it's good to be human. It's good to be a creature. And we shouldn't be at war with that, because in doing so, we're at war with ourselves. So, Tim, thanks for talking more about this conversation. I think there's much more to unpack, and we'll do that next week with my conversation with Kelly Kapic about his book, You're Only Human. So I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to listening to it.